Euthanasia is being offered as a form of compassion, an act of mercy. But is it really? We'll talk about that and more in this edition of Life Matters with Brian Johnston. Brian Johnston is the Western Director of the National Right to Life Committee. He has served in many capacities while advocating for innocent lives. As California Commissioner on Aging, as Chairman of the California Pro-Life Council, on the board of the National Legal Center for the Medically Dependent and Disabled. He is an author and lecturer, a film producer, and commentator. And now, here's our host, Brian Johnston.
Well, hi, and welcome again to Life Matters, your program on life and culture. And I'm your host, Brian Johnston. We're going to be talking today about a very serious issue. It's an issue that's very much with us. But I want to remind you what our program is about. Our program is about the issues of life, as they impact you. The issues of life aren't just some vague concept or some religious idea. The right to life is a very specific legal assertion that we draw from our founding documents. It describes the relationship between the government and individual human lives, and the duty of the government to protect the individual human lives in its care. And all just governments derive their authority from the value of the governed, and it's not vice versa. So the laws are there to protect the lives of those who can't protect themselves. That's the first premise of what the right to life is. The implications of that are legion, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about those things. Today we're going to talk about a very serious issue that if you haven't been paying attention, you need to wake up quickly. We are facing a silver tsunami as a culture. We are facing the aging of America. All of Western civilization is facing this. We, in particular in the United States, are facing it, and it's hit us already, and the implications are growing. The arguments we have regarding healthcare, the argument regarding the assisted suicide debate is not happening in a vacuum. The issue of how we treat our elderly, or, if you will, any of the medically dependent. It's just a reality, though, as you get older, you are more likely to become medically dependent, or dependent somehow, even emotionally, physically, on the goodwill of others. Most societies have recognized that and honor the vulnerable elderly in their midst. And many Asian cultures with very deep bows. You don't have to be a person of substance. It is your seniority that gives you substance and honor. We've lost that in the United States, and we've lost it in a lot of Western culture. We're going to talk about the implications for us right now, whether you're elderly or not. This is a very serious issue. One of the things, those of you who do know me know that I've been dealing with this issue for quite some time. When I was younger, I, in fact, was a commissioner on aging in California when I was much younger. I'm so much, it's kind of like Benjamin Button, maybe. I've gotten younger as I've gotten older. No, but quite seriously, I've been looking at this issue for a while, and it's very clear. One of the reasons I looked at this is that you have one of two options. You're either going to get older or you're going to die. So I suggest everybody look at the reality that it's okay to get older. As a culture, we don't like it. We have a youth-enamored culture, and it's not just Beach Boy music. It's not just how we look at the consumer market. We're being fed a youth culture, but we need to recognize that that doesn't change biology and it doesn't change reality. So we must be cognizant of what that means. So let me start by giving a few cold, hard statistics. The fact is that in the year 1900, according to the U.S. Census, 6.4% of the whole population was either 60 or older. That's 6.4% at the turn of the last century, not the most recent one. At the turn of the most recent century, in 2000, that number had jumped. And as you know, there's many reasons for that. We're not going to go into the reasons for it, but that number has jumped. People are, in fact, more vibrant. People are indeed getting older, but the implications are great. And in the year 2000, that had jumped to 16.8% of the population as being 60 or older. However, now what we're looking at is by the year 2020, that's going to jump again to 22%. of the population being 60 or older. And by the year 2050, more than 1/4 of the whole population will be over 60. What that means, of course, is that they won't be working necessarily. There will a lot of folks will be working because they didn't save. But the notion of retirement, we know that's changing. But more than anything else, in terms of what's happened most recently in our culture, the dramatic change in healthcare and its provision, the National Socialized Healthcare Program under Obamacare actually impacts those who need it the most. Believe it or not, the benefits that accrue to those in need, it's when you're older you're going to need it. Historically, it's women who tend to use medicine more than men. And the older you get, both genders tend to need more medical attention. They're the real need. In fact, if you followed Obamacare, the only way Obamacare could possibly have succeeded was if the very young kids from 18 on up through their 30s, if they still signed up for healthcare and paid for it, in reality, they don't really use it. So they would be the ones pouring money in. And that was the only hope that Obamacare had, is that there would be that whole spectrum of the population that basically was not availing of healthcare. They were simply paying into it. And as you know, Obamacare hasn't worked. It has been an abysmal failure, and yet there are people now looking to the government for their healthcare, and they have a government that's wanting to cut those costs of healthcare. And of course, it's the elderly who will be targeted in that. So we see a huge tsunami of elderly coming our way. It's already happened. We are now at 20%, a little over 20% of our population, 60 and above. It's going to be 1/4 of the population shortly. And we're not going to have the workers to pay the Social Security. It's going to get very, very interesting. So the issues now of life that we're going to touch on, the arguments about the principle of autonomy when it comes to suicide or assisted suicide, the issue of healthcare provision, the issue of the right to life, these aren't happening in a vacuum. This is happening in a very cold utilitarian reality we've got to be aware of, and there's ways to address that. When we come back, I'm going to talk about how we address it, how we can care for our elderly, how we can address the real needs of our culture, how we can restore respect for those in need, and how other cultures have successfully addressed the needs of the elderly, not by dismissing them, but by seeing how family can be restored. I believe that family is the heart of this, not government, but the care of others, the care of loved ones, is ultimately what we have to go back to. It's what has built society, and it's what's going to allow society to continue. We'll be back in just a second.
If you have questions or comments for Life Matters, call 800-924-2490. Give us your name and the town you're calling from, and a quick question or comment. And now back to more Life Matters with Brian Johnston.
Hey there, so we're back, and we're talking about the silver tsunami that's hitting our culture. We're talking about aging and getting older. As I mentioned before, it's a good thing. Don't think that's a bad thing. It's good to get older. That means you're alive. And so what we want to do is encourage one another to age well. That's why your mom, when you were a child, told you to eat your vegetables. So you want to eat properly, you want to exercise, but there's a lot of implications for us right now. I want to talk for a moment about a growing phenomenon, and that is the phenomenon of elder abuse. Elder abuse is growing very rapidly across our nation. When I was a commissioner on aging, I was one of the conveners of a California conference called CEASE, and that stood for California Elder Abuse Summit on Empowerment. How can we empower people to intervene and to prevent elder abuse? There are several different types of elder abuse. There's emotional abuse. There's physical abuse, of course. You're aware of that. And that one of the subsets of that is sexual abuse, unfortunately. And then a very common phenomenon, sadly, particularly amongst children without scruples, taking advantage of relatives and sometimes even neighbors, or if they're caregivers, is the issue of financial abuse of the elderly because they are dependent on others to help them with their finances. Those are, generically speaking, the three forms of abuse. But more to the point, I want to address, and those of you who know me know that I've dealt with this issue for a while, the push for legalizing assisted suicide. Assisted suicide is, in fact, a recipe for the ultimate form of elder abuse, because assisted suicide is designed for a specific portion of the population. As you know, it's declared, well, if someone's about to die, if they have 6 months or less to live, we should be free to help them be dead. And it's emotionally attractive, but in fact, it's not something that's offered to you or me. If you or I were to go to the top of a 10-story building and threaten to jump, someone would intervene and would talk us out of it. Someone would say, wait, don't kill yourself. And the reason is not to keep the sidewalks clean. The reason is that it's not a good idea if you're emotionally distraught to end your life. It's just not. And we know that the desire for suicide is the number one indicator that someone is emotionally distraught. Well, you may not know, a lot of people think the highest suicide rate is amongst youth. The highest suicide rate, as it is amongst elderly white men. And there's a reason for that. We won't go into great detail, but they feel very much alone. And it's that loneliness, and that's often the case in all suicides, whether it is a teenager who lost a boyfriend or girlfriend, whether it's someone who's had a financial setback. It's that sense of loss and loneliness. And that can increase when you're older. If we say, yeah, if you're old and you're not productive and you're going to die eventually anyways, we think you're in a class of people that we're not going to protect anymore from suicide. In fact, we're going to provide poison for you if you can get a doctor's note that maybe there's 6 months left for you. And again, all honest oncologists will tell you that's purely arbitrary and conjecture. Many of us know friends and family, and the documentation in the various states have legalized this, have shown that many of those given poison live for years, even though supposedly they were going to die within 6 months, and yet they're still alive 5 years later. They kind of decided not to take the poison. That is prima facie evidence that the notion that, well, it's only for certain people. No, it's for people that we think should be dead. This is not about helping someone who's dying. Remember, someone is dying. It's a very specific verb. If you're dying, that means you die. This is actually for someone who isn't dying fast enough according to someone else's schedule. We want to have assisted suicide because, man, they're still around, and we think they should be dead. So this is a very powerful emotional argument. I have to tell you, I believe that the elderly are one of the number one targets for that. And when it comes to abuse, assisted suicide would be the number one form of elder abuse because it's a good way to save on funds. It's a good way to keep not just health care down, but then we don't have to go visit grandma and grandpa anymore. There's quite a few myths about medical care as you get older. And of course, one of the standard myths, it's often repeated, is that in the last year of your life, so much money is spent unnecessarily because, gosh, that person's going to die anyways. So there you see the real heart of the moral intellectual argument is this person is going to die anyways. But I want to address the myth about healthcare because there have been studies done. One study was done in conjunction with the Open Society Institute's project on death in America, and it found that of the 7 deadly myths about the last year of life, the number one misconception is that older people commonly receive heroic, high-tech treatments at the end of life, when in fact, fewer than half of all people over 65 even die in the hospital. And the older people are, the less likely they are to receive aggressive care when dying. So already, as you get older, it is less likely there's going to be intervention. It is less likely going to have aggressive treatment. There was a separate study which appeared in the Journal of the American Geriatric Society, and it found that seriously ill elderly patients are much less likely to undergo surgery and other costly treatment than younger patients. Patients 80 and older underwent surgery about half as often as the under 50-year-old patients with the same illness. and their hospital bills tend to average about $7,000 less. So you need to understand this, that it's already the case that we are not intervening.
Do you have a question about the right to life? Call our Lifeline anytime at 800-924-2490 or visit us online at lifematters.life. And now back to more about life, culture, and the battle of ideas with Brian Johnston.
So that being said, I think it leads us to the next very important question. We're making a distinction here with assisted suicide and other forms of direct euthanasia using medicine as a lethal tool against the patient, which violates the Hippocratic Oath. But this leads us to another more subtle form of euthanasia, and that is the intentional denial of life-sustaining treatment for those who are seen as less than perfect, and that's what's happening with the elderly. The elderly are being seen as one more set of disabled. Getting older is a disability in the eyes of the culturally perfect, and we have to recognize the subtle messages that are being sent as treatment is being denied, treatment that in fact is beneficial in many ways, but is considered, the term of art is futile. That's futile care. They're not talking about the effect of the treatment. They're talking about the human being. Keeping that person alive is futile. The treatment itself could be very, very effective. One case is food and water. We know that when food and water is taken away from a patient, you think of Terri Schiavo. Well, that's happening in senior care homes all the time. You take away food and water, that person will die. And yet that's called futile treatment. No, the treatment is very effective. It's very simple. You need nutrition and hydration to survive. If it's provided, then you live. But it's the life they consider to be futile. Why be an old person? So this notion of medical futility is incredibly dangerous and incredibly subtle. And we must recognize that this pressure is all around us with managed care. Managed care has become a form of care in which those who are the managers make the medical decisions. And in fact, the doctors themselves don't make the ultimate decision about what's necessary for the patient because the managers think it might cost too much. This is obvious in government-sponsored healthcare, but it's just as obvious in other forms of managed care in the HMO system. One of the most insidious is when they ask and pressure the physician to be partakers in this form of rationing that decides who's worth caring for. One form is known as capitation. You may want to talk to your healthcare provider and see if they use capitation or if they use PPO, which is a pay for service. Capitation is where a physician is given a certain number of patients per capita. Let's say, for example, that doctor is given 100 patients to care for, and the system gives that doctor $1,000 worth to spend in the fiscal year. So that's $100,000. Again, I'm using this for an illustration. If a patient is going to cost a lot more than $1,000, the money comes out of the doctor's hide. And that makes the physician now very much a participant in the intentional denial of treatment for fiscal reasons. Now, the treatment can be very, very effective, but they will use the phrase futile care because they think that human life itself, that elderly person, well, since now they're over 60, why should we treat their kidney disease? Because, if they were in their 30s, we'll treat their kidney disease. But since they're over 60, we're not going to do it. Something very, very common is when certain infectious illnesses that require antibiotics, it's very common to simply not give the antibiotic and hope that that illness will kill the elderly person. Whereas the antibiotic can be very effective. The notion is, well, we just want to keep this person around because they're going to get sick from something else and we'll have to take care of them. So let's just not care for them. And this notion of rationing is incredibly insidious. It's very inviting. If you look at just the bottom line of dollars and cents, it is almost compelling, and they will compel you, even though by denying grandma that food and water, that's intentionally ensuring she'll be dead. By denying her antibiotics, and it's something that could be quickly cleared up, you're intentionally allowing now that illness to take her life, and it need not be a terminal illness. So this is a very subtle message we're seeing in the silver tsunami, the pressure to save money, the fact that we have not had children, that's obviously related to the way we treat children, and the abortion issue now. Most of those kids would be 40 years old, and they're not paying the taxes because they're not there. The resources are not there, and we're paying the price. So that's why euthanasia and the dismissal of the elderly is so insidious, so real, and very much with us. If you'd like more information on the whole issue of rationing, please go to nrlc.org and look up rationing. If you'd like to have more information on what you can do to make sure that doesn't happen to you and your loved ones, go to nrlc.org, National Right to Life Committee.org, and get involved in your local or your state chapter. Thanks very much. We'll be back after this.
Wordsworth here. Get your Wordsworth. Wordsworth here. Get your Wordsworth.
Just like at a ball game, you can't know the players without a program. Wordsworth is that part of our program that helps you look at the real meaning of words and phrases that are being used against you and against the value and significance of individual lives.
Wordsworth is that part of our program where we spend time talking about language and language itself, which is essential in the battle of ideas. Ideas must be expressed in words, and words are the building blocks of language. If, however, you don't understand the nature of the words, or what's worse, if you understand words to mean one thing, and they're intentionally being twisted to mean something entirely different, then you'll lose in the battle of ideas. So semantics, that is to say, the use of words and their meaning and the abuse of words and their meaning, very, very important in this battle, and we want to equip you to deal with it. Now, in particular, the battle around the growing senior crisis, the silver tsunami, which is very real and very much with us. You've already seen what's happened when it comes to healthcare reform, or what I would really call healthcare deform, because the way we have changed healthcare in America has really destroyed one of the most advanced and most protective medical systems that had ever been developed in the history of mankind. Now, you have heard from our opponents and ideologues who want to change America, who condemn America's prosperity, but that prosperity has helped people across the board. It's been the prosperity of America that's allowed people to live more productive lives, to live vibrant lives, who otherwise would have been dismissed by an impoverished culture. So the poverty that we're coming up against now is an impoverishment of the mind and those ideas that dismiss human lives. One of the most important phrases that you're going to hear now in this battle of the elderly and how we deal with the elderly is the notion of futility and medical futility. So it's often presented that we would help this patient, we could do these things, but it's actually futile. That implies that the procedure itself wouldn't help, that the procedure itself isn't very effective, but that is often not what the meaning is. What the meaning is, yes, we could do that, and it'll help them stay alive for a little while longer, but they're going to die anyways, So why are we prolonging their death? When in fact, the treatment is not doing that. It's actually saving their lives. And people who would like life-saving treatment, who actually could go on to live for several years, are denied it in the name of futility, medical futility. But the term futility is not really referring to the medicine, it's referring to the patient. It would be futile to keep that older person around long. So the treatments that are used often have to do with very basic comfort care that keeps you alive. Food and water is the most obvious. If you're denied food and water, you will die. I don't care how old you are. you do not have access to food and water, you will not be biologically tenacious enough to survive. As we mentioned earlier in the program, now being a senior is considered a disability. So there could be relatively straightforward cures and benefits and treatments offered to a patient, but it's denied them. Not because the treatment won't be effective, but because it will be effective. It's denied to them because we don't think that senior person should keep on living. And think about it this way. You know, I have a friend who collects old cars, old Studebakers, and he's always tinkering. And he has to go and get parts, and he's glad to do it. So some of his cars have 400,000, 500,000 miles on them, and he's glad to do it because he likes old Studebakers. They don't make them anymore. They don't make people like you anymore. But some people would say what he's doing is futile. It's futile because that car is not getting any younger. Some other part will be needed in a month or two, and therefore what he's doing is futile. But it's not futile. That's his car. That's his Studebaker Lark, and it's unique to him, and he loves that vehicle. So he's collecting and taking care of it. What medical futility as an idea does, it says, look, you may want to stay alive, or you may want to keep grandma around, and she may want to stay around. But we don't want that car on the road anymore. We've had enough of her. And because of her age, she simply will not be fixed, even though she could, even though it will keep the car running. No, we don't want you to savor and appreciate that old thing. And that's what's meant by medical futility. So be very careful when you're in a situation, you hear a phrase like medical futility, that it's really being used to turn against patients. It's not a statement regarding the efficacy of the medicine. It's a statement regarding the life of that individual. Thanks. Bye.
Learn more about everything in today's show online at lifematters.life, where you'll find all the resources you need to protect life. For more information, call 800-924-2490. Listen to more Life Matters, Saturdays at 1 p.m. right here on K-Bright.